images of ambition, courage, and hubris. And in the muddy fields where men once fought and died, history changed forever. Welcome to Historical Moments, where we take you on a journey through time. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you fascinating stories, pivotal events, and unforgettable moments that have shaped our world. Whether it's a significant battle, a game-changing discovery, or a moment of triumph, we uncover the history that defines us. Subscribe and join us as we explore the past, one moment at a time. It's 1813, and the mighty shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte, once the master of Europe, begins to fade. The man who reshaped the continent through war and diplomacy now faces the greatest challenge of his life: staying in power as the world turns against him. After the disastrous retreat from Russia in 1812, Napoleon's aura of invincibility was shattered. The Grande Armée, reduced to a hollow shell, limped back to France. The losses were staggering: 500,000 men gone, and with them, the confidence of his allies and the fear of his enemies. Europe smelled blood, and the coalition of powers that had been beaten time and again began to regroup. The Sixth Coalition, led by Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, launched a new offensive in 1813. The tide turned against Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of Nations. For 4 grueling days, Napoleon fought to hold his empire together. But it was not enough. The combined armies overwhelmed his forces, and the emperor retreated back to France, his empire unraveling behind him. But Napoleon was not a man who surrendered easily. Even as his allies abandoned him and foreign forces pushed into French territory, he worked tirelessly, drafting new armies from boys and veterans alike. He fought a brilliant defense, winning several battles in early 1814, defying the odds and earning admiration from friend and foe alike. Yet his victories were fleeting, mere patches on a sinking ship. By April 1814, Paris fell. Napoleon's marshals, men who had served him loyally for years, finally turned against him. They saw the writing on the wall and pressured him to abdicate. Napoleon, defeated but defiant, stepped down, and the Treaty of Fontainebleau sent him into exile on the island of Elba. But this was not the end. In 1815, Napoleon staged the comeback of comebacks, escaping Elba and returning to France. Crowds flocked to him, and within weeks, he reclaimed his throne. The 100 Days had begun, a brief, blazing attempt to restore his empire. His enemies, however, moved swiftly. At Waterloo, Napoleon faced the Seventh Coalition, and despite his brilliance, he was decisively defeated. His power broken for good, Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he spent the final years of his life, a prisoner of the nations he had once dominated. A man who had risen so high, who had changed the world so profoundly, had fallen. But as he gazed out over the endless ocean, his mind surely lingered on one thought. Even in defeat, the name Napoleon would never be forgotten. October 1813. The fields outside Leipzig, Germany, were cloaked in an eerie morning mist. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the distant thunder of cannons. Almost 500,000 soldiers, French, Russian, Prussian, Austrian, stood poised for battle. What was about to unfold would be the largest battle in European history up to that point. The Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations. And at the center of it all was one man, Napoleon Bonaparte, fighting desperately to maintain his grip on Europe. The sun pierced through the mist, illuminating the sprawling armies. Napoleon observed the scene from his vantage point, his gaze steely, his mind racing. Once, he had been the scourge of Europe, the architect of a vast empire that stretched from Spain to Poland. But now the tide had turned. The Allies, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, had formed a formidable coalition unified by one goal: the destruction of Napoleon's dominance. To understand the stakes, you need to go back a year. In 1812, Napoleon had suffered a catastrophic defeat during his invasion of Russia. His once mighty Grande Armée had been shattered by the brutal winter, starvation, and relentless Russian attacks. Though he had managed to raise another army, his enemies smelled blood. They saw an opportunity to strike while the emperor was vulnerable. By October 1813, Napoleon's forces, numbering around 200,000, were trapped in Saxony. Surrounding him were more than 300,000 Allied troops. The Allies had one simple plan: encircle and destroy Napoleon's army. For Napoleon, the stakes couldn't have been higher. If he lost, it wouldn't just be the end of this campaign, it could be the end of his empire. On October 16th, the first day of battle, Napoleon struck first. His strategy was bold, as always. He aimed to divide the Allied forces and defeat them piecemeal before they could overwhelm him with their superior numbers. But the Allies had learned from Napoleon's past victories. They no longer fought as disorganized coalitions. Instead, they had developed a coordinated strategy and a unity of purpose. At every turn, they countered Napoleon's maneuvers. Prussian General Blücher struck hard in the north, while the Austrians held firm in the south. The battle seesawed throughout the day, neither side gaining a decisive advantage. As night fell, the fields were littered with the dead and dying. Fires dotted the horizon, casting an orange glow over the carnage. Napoleon gathered his marshals for a council of war. They were grim-faced, aware of the precariousness of their position. Napoleon, ever the optimist, believed he could still break through the Allied lines. But his marshals were less certain. They knew reinforcements were coming, for the Allies, not the French. Napoleon's fears were confirmed on October 17th and 18th. More and more Allied troops poured into the battlefield, tipping the scales against the French. By the third day, Napoleon's forces were outnumbered nearly 2-1. The Allies pressed their advantage, launching relentless assaults on Napoleon's positions. Villages that had been fiercely contested, Probstheida, Wachau, and Muckern, became scenes of brutal urban combat, with soldiers fighting hand-to-hand amidst burning buildings and rubble. One of the most critical moments came on October 19th, the final day of the battle. Recognizing that his position was now untenable, Napoleon ordered a retreat across the only escape route available, a bridge over the Elster River. But disaster struck. A panicked French officer prematurely set off explosives, destroying the bridge and trapping thousands of French soldiers on the wrong side. Many drowned in the river, while others were captured by the advancing Allies. It was chaos, the kind of chaos that Napoleon had always inflicted on his enemies, but now it was his army that suffered. By the end of the battle, Napoleon's army was in ruins. Over 80,000 men had been killed, wounded, or captured, one of the bloodiest battles in history. The Allied casualties were also staggering, but their losses were secondary to the magnitude of their victory. Napoleon had been decisively defeated, his aura of invincibility shattered. The Battle of Leipzig marked a turning point in European history. After his defeat, Napoleon retreated to France, his empire crumbling around him. Within 6 months, Paris would fall, and Napoleon would be forced to abdicate, ending more than a decade of near-constant warfare across the continent. For the people of Europe, the Battle of Leipzig was a symbol of hope, the hope that the wars that had devastated their lives and consumed countless lives might finally come to an end. For Napoleon, it was the beginning of the end. Though he would return briefly during the 100 Days, culminating in his final defeat at Waterloo, the Battle of Leipzig marked the moment when the tide of history turned against him for good. As the smoke cleared and the bodies were buried, the fields outside Leipzig bore witness to the truth. Even the greatest conquerors are not invincible. The legacy of the battle would linger for generations, a testament to the fragility of power, the cost of ambition, and the enduring resilience of those who dare to resist it. Europe, 1813. The continent is ablaze. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who held all of Europe under his heel, is about to face the greatest challenge of his career, a united front of nations determined to break his empire apart. This is the campaign of the Sixth Coalition. To understand this moment, we must first step back to 1812, when Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia set the stage for his downfall. The Grande Armée, nearly 500,000 strong, had marched deep into Russian territory but returned shattered, frozen and decimated by hunger and disease. It was a defeat so catastrophic that it emboldened his enemies, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, and even Sweden, to lay their differences aside and unite against him. They were ready to take on the Emperor of France, not just to defeat him in battle, but to dismantle his empire entirely. But Napoleon was not a man to go quietly. In the spring of 1813, he raised another massive army. Conscripts, many of them young and inexperienced. While his forces lacked the hardened veterans of earlier campaigns, Napoleon still had his unmatched strategic genius. However, the coalition was committed. They saw their opportunity to destroy Napoleon's dominance, and they were willing to do whatever it took. The campaign began with a bang. In May of 1813, Napoleon struck back at his enemies with vigor. At the battles of Lutzen and Bautzen, his forces defeated the Russians and Prussians, showcasing that, even weakened, Napoleon was still a master of the battlefield. His swift attacks and use of concentrated artillery were enough to remind his opponents of his brilliance. The coalition forces were momentarily stunned, agreeing to an armistice in June to regroup. During this pause, Napoleon hoped to divide the coalition, perhaps to negotiate peace with Austria, who had joined his enemies despite the emperor being married to an Austrian princess. But his hopes were dashed. The coalition only grew stronger. Britain sent funds, supplies, and troops to bolster the armies of Europe. Austria fully committed its forces, and Sweden's crown prince, an ex-marshal of the French Empire himself, joined the fight as well. By late summer, the armistice dissolved, and the war resumed on an even larger scale. Now Napoleon faced not just one or two adversaries on the battlefield, but a coordinated and ever-adapting enemy. The coalition armies developed a strategy known as the Trachtenberg Plan. They agreed to avoid direct confrontations with Napoleon himself whenever possible, focusing instead on overwhelming his marshals and cutting off his supply lines. It was a war of attrition, meant to bleed the French Empire dry. The key moment in the campaign came in October of 1813 at Leipzig in Saxony. A battle so massive it would come to be known as the Battle of the Nations. Over 500,000 soldiers clashed in a chaotic, 4-day struggle across rivers, hills, and villages. On one side stood Napoleon, leading his dwindling French forces with all the cunning he could muster. On the other, an enormous allied army of Russians, Austrians, Prussians, and Swedes united in their goal to crush him once and for all. The first days of the battle were inconclusive. Napoleon's forces held their own, using the terrain and their artillery with precision. But the sheer weight of the coalition's numbers began to take its toll. Napoleon himself sensed the tide turning, but refused to admit defeat. On October 18th, the situation reached a breaking point. The Saxon troops, once loyal to Napoleon, switched sides mid-battle, firing on French soldiers they had fought alongside just hours before. It was a devastating betrayal. By the next day, Napoleon's forces were in full retreat, crossing the Elster River in disarray. Thousands drowned when a crucial bridge was destroyed too early. Over 70,000 men lay dead, wounded, or captured by the end of the battle. It was Europe's bloodiest confrontation up to that point, and the writing on the wall for Napoleon's empire. After Leipzig, the collapse was unstoppable. The coalition forces surged forward, advancing through Germany and into France itself. Along the way, they liberated kingdoms and principalities that had once been forced into Napoleon's orbit. Paris, Napoleon's great capital, fell in March of 1814. The once mighty emperor was forced to abdicate just weeks later. His enemies exiled him to the island of Elba, a small speck in the Mediterranean, a far cry from the glory of ruling over half of Europe. The campaign of the Sixth Coalition marked the end of Napoleon's reign as Emperor of the French. But its significance extended beyond the man himself. It signaled the end of an era. The coalition's victory set the stage for the Congress of Vienna, where Europe's leaders redrew the map of the continent, striving to create a balance of power that would prevent another figure like Napoleon from ever dominating them again. But the story of Napoleon wasn't over. Even from exile, he dreamed of a comeback. The Sixth Coalition didn't just defeat Napoleon on the battlefield, it shattered the illusion of his invincibility. It showed that even the greatest generals are only human, and that no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to the currents of history. This was the campaign of the Sixth Coalition, a titanic struggle, a tale of ambition, pride, and perseverance. The defeat of one man and the triumph of a world united against him. History turned its page. What would come next was a new chapter for Europe, one shaped by the lessons learned in the fiery crucible of war. The year was 1815, and Europe was at peace, for the moment. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the emperor of the French and master of the continent, had fallen from his unparalleled heights. Europe had pushed back against the shadow he cast, uniting their armies to force him into exile. He now existed as a man without a country, banished to the windswept island of Elba in the Mediterranean. For 10 months, Napoleon sat restless on his tiny island. He held court like an emperor still, planning roads and reforms for an island he knew could never satisfy him. But Napoleon was never one to accept defeat. His mind simmered with thoughts of escape, of reclaiming the empire that, in his eyes, had never truly stopped being his. In March 1815, the unthinkable happened. Napoleon escaped Elba. He slipped past the British ships meant to guard him, sailing to mainland France under cover of night. The moment his boots touched French soil, the 100 days began. Imagine this scene. Napoleon steps ashore onto the French Riviera near Gulf Huon. He had come with fewer than 1,000 loyal men, dressed not in regal attire, but in the everyday uniform of the soldiers who had once fought for him. He had no crown, no banners, and no guarantee of survival. Yet he had one weapon, his presence, and the loyalty he could command with it. His march to Paris was a gamble unlike any he had taken before. Would the French people welcome him back, or would they turn him over to King Louis XVIII, the monarch who now ruled France under the Bourbon Restoration? The answer came quickly, as his gamble turned into one of the most fascinating comebacks in history. Napoleon didn't storm Paris with force. No, his march was one built on persuasion, charisma, and sheer willpower. The French soldiers sent to arrest him quickly found themselves lowering their weapons as the man they had once called emperor addressed them directly. He was theatrical, raising his arms wide, exposing his chest to their muskets. "If any man here would shoot his emperor," Napoleon declared to one such regiment, "do it now."
If any man here would shoot his emperor, do it now.
Not one musket fired. Instead, cheers erupted. The soldiers joined him, their ranks swelling until he marched with a force strong enough to cast fear into the Bourbon king. Louis XVIII fled Paris less than a month after Napoleon's landing. On March 20th, Napoleon entered the city, reclaiming the throne he had lost less than a year earlier. The emperor was back, but France and Europe had changed. Napoleon returned to an empire fragile and wary. The French, weary of war, still idolized him as a leader, yet they feared the storm his return would inevitably bring. While many in France rallied behind his cause, Europe saw his escape from Elba as a call to arms. The Allied powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, rejected Napoleon's dream of reclaiming his empire and declared war almost immediately. Napoleon, determined to act first, rallied his forces with lightning speed. His ability to whip armies into shape was legendary. But even he knew time was against him. Europe's armies were vast and coordinated, ready to crush him once and for all. As spring turned to summer, Napoleon's 100 days came to their breaking point, the campaign that would define his legacy forever. The location? A quiet crossroads in Belgium, near the village of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo unfolded on June 18, 1815, and it marked the crescendo of Napoleon's dramatic return. Against him stood the British army, led by the Duke of Wellington and the Prussians under Marshal Blucher. Together, their forces dwarfed Napoleon's army in manpower. Yet Napoleon had always thrived in situations where victory seemed impossible. The battle began with cannons roaring and rain-soaked fields churned into chaos. Napoleon personally oversaw his troops, hoping his tactical genius would carry the day. Time and again, he had faced overwhelming odds and emerged victorious. But this time, the circumstances were different. The Allied armies fought with a desperation born out of the knowledge that Europe could not tolerate another era of Napoleonic dominance. At first, the battle swung in Napoleon's favor. His men pushed the British hard, nearly breaking their lines. But Napoleon's forces faced logistical challenges. They lacked reinforcements and coordination with the rest of their movements. And then came the moment that sealed their fate, the arrival of the Prussian forces late in the day. From the east, tens of thousands of Prussian soldiers surged onto the battlefield, tipping the scales decisively against Napoleon. Even as the tide turned, Napoleon fought on. He sent his elite Imperial Guard into battle in a final desperate attempt to break Wellington's lines. But this time, his legendary soldiers were repulsed. What followed was chaos and retreat. Napoleon watched helplessly as his empire crumbled in front of him. By nightfall, it was clear. Napoleon had lost. The 100 days were over, and this time, there would be no escape, no comeback. The defeat at Waterloo marked the end of an era. Napoleon's ambition had burned brightly, but ultimately it consumed itself. Within weeks, he was forced to abdicate once again. This time, he was exiled not to Elba, but to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would spend the remainder of his life, far from Europe, far from power. The 100 days had been more than a military campaign. They were a testament to Napoleon's resilience, his audacious charisma, and his refusal to surrender to fate. But they were also a cautionary tale about ambition pushing too far, about the limits of one man against the weight of an entire continent. Napoleon died in exile on St. Helena 6 years after his defeat, but his legend lived on. Even today, the 100 days evoke a sense of awe and drama. The story of an emperor who dared to make one last gamble against the impossible. It is a story of triumph, tragedy, and the fleeting nature of power, a reminder that history, while shaped by human will, often has the final word. The morning of June 18th, 1815, began with mud. Thick gray clouds hung low over the Belgian countryside, heavy with the storm that had poured down during the night. The fields around the small village of Waterloo, once quiet farmland, were now churned into a muddy quagmire under the boots of tens of thousands of soldiers. For two great commanders, Napoleon Bonaparte and Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, this was the morning that would decide the fate of Europe. Napoleon, the once unrivaled emperor of France, had returned from exile the year before to reclaim his throne. But his return had plunged Europe into chaos. A coalition of powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, moved quickly to stop him once and for all. Facing armies converging from multiple directions, Napoleon gambled on speed and surprise, marching into Belgium to strike the coalition forces before they could properly unite. By the time the sun rose over the damp fields that morning, Napoleon was poised for what he believed would be his greatest victory. His 72,000-strong army stretched across the ridges, veterans of countless campaigns who still believed in their emperor's invincibility. But across the muddy valley, the Allied army under the Duke of Wellington prepared for battle as well. Wellington had positioned his forces along a ridge, using the terrain to their advantage. His 68,000 men were a patchwork of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, many of them inexperienced, but they were resolute. Reinforcements from the Prussian army, led by Field Marshal Blücher, were on their way if Wellington could hold long enough. The battlefield itself was tight and constrained, flanked by a scattering of farms and manor houses. Three strong points dominated the field: the Chateau of Hougoumont to the west, the small village of La Haye-Sainte in the center, and the hamlet of Papelotte to the east. These locations would become crucibles of fire and slaughter. The first shots rang out around 11:30 in the morning. Napoleon ordered a diversionary attack on Hougoumont, hoping to draw Wellington's reserves to the west. The chateau was heavily manned, and as French infantry surged forward, the fighting turned into a brutal, grinding melee. For hours, the British guards defending Hougoumont withstood wave after wave of French attacks. The farm buildings caught fire, timbers collapsing in clouds of smoke and ash. In the chaos, a group of French soldiers breached the gates, only to be driven back in hand-to-hand combat. By the end of the battle, the ground around Hougoumont was littered with the fallen, and the fighting there had drawn in far more French forces than Napoleon had anticipated. As the struggle for Hougoumont raged on, Napoleon turned his focus to the center. A great ridge separated the two armies, and by midday, the French artillery began pounding the Allied lines, sending fountains of mud and shrapnel into the air. Yet the rain-soaked ground worked against Napoleon's gunners. The cannonballs that were supposed to ricochet through columns of men instead sank into the soft earth, their destructive power blunted. Believing the time was right, Napoleon ordered a massive infantry assault against Wellington's center, aiming to break through at La Haye-Sainte. The French columns advanced uphill, their bayonets glinting dully in the overcast light. Wellington's men waited behind the ridge, sheltering from artillery fire. "Stand firm," their officers commanded, and when the French crested the hill, the red-coated infantry opened fire. Muskets roared, and the French columns faltered under the withering volleys. Yet still they pressed forward, engaging in brutal close combat to take the stone farmhouse at La Haye-Sainte. By mid-afternoon, Napoleon began to sense that time was slipping away. To the east, the Prussians had started to arrive. He could see their black-coated uniforms in the distance, and the sound of cannon from their skirmishes grew steadily louder. But the Emperor was not ready to give up the field. At around 4 o'clock p.m., Napoleon launched one of the most infamous cavalry charges in history. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, led tens of thousands of French horsemen in a massive assault. They galloped toward the Allied line, swords flashing, seeking to shatter Wellington's center. The Allied infantry responded with iron discipline, forming squares, tight formations of bayonets angled outward, impenetrable to cavalry. Again and again, the French cavalry charged through the smoke-filled valley, only to be driven back with heavy losses. Exhausted and demoralized, Ney's horsemen had accomplished little more than giving their enemy the time to regroup. As evening fell, the battlefield was a scene of unimaginable carnage. Smoke clouded the air, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the fields. Napoleon's forces still had one last hope of victory: the Imperial Guard, his elite and most loyal troops. At around 7:30 p.m., they advanced in a final desperate push to break Wellington's line. The sight of their bearskin hats and disciplined ranks struck fear into the Allied troops. But Wellington was prepared. Hidden behind the ridge, fresh Allied infantry awaited the Imperial Guard. As the French approached, Wellington's men rose and fired devastating volleys. The Guard hesitated, wavered, and then, unthinkably, began to retreat. Seeing the invincible Imperial Guard fall back, the rest of the French army broke. Panic rippled through Napoleon's ranks. "La Garde recule!" they shouted in disbelief. "The Guard retreats." The Allied line surged forward, driving the French from the field. Napoleon's hopes of victory and his empire were shattered. As darkness fell, the battle was over, and the Prussians arrived to finish what Wellington's men had begun. The cost was staggering. Nearly 50,000 men lay dead or wounded on the field of Waterloo. The rolling hills and farms that had been an ordinary slice of rural Belgium that morning were now a charnel house. Napoleon fled to Paris, his dreams of glory reduced to ashes. Within weeks, he surrendered to the British and was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would spend the rest of his life. For Wellington, it was an extraordinary triumph, but he would later describe the battle as the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. And for Europe, the victory at Waterloo marked the dawn of a new era. It ended 2 decades of Napoleonic Wars and ushered in a fragile peace enforced by the Congress of Vienna. But the legacy of Waterloo would endure far beyond the battlefield. It became a symbol of finality and fate, a word that could evoke images of ambition, courage, and hubris. And in the muddy fields where men once fought and died, history changed forever. Thank you for watching Historical Moments. We hope you enjoyed this trip through history. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories from the past. Until next time, keep exploring the moments that changed history.